Hi, Bhante.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Bhikkhu Bodhi, and we should maybe explain for some people that the Bhikkhu part means monk and refers to the fact that you are an ordained Buddhist monk. You're also a noted thinker about Buddhism, and I would highly recommend your lectures on Buddhism, and we'll provide a link for people who want to download them. But you're particularly known as a translator of things like this, the connected discourses of the Buddha.
Wow, that's very happy.
This is your, which runs over 2,000 pages, including your annotated footnotes and index and so on. And you also translated other parts of the Buddhist canon, the Middle Length Discourses and so on. So that's a lot of work. And maybe I should start by asking you what inspired you to undertake such a vast commitment.
Yeah, originally I had no intention to become a translator. But when I went to Sri Lanka, I went in 1972 to be ordained as a monk. I knew that I wanted to read the Buddha's discourses and to read them in the original, in the Pali language. Pali, it's an ancient Indian language, probably never really a spoken language, but rather a composite language, which was used to preserve the Buddha's discourses in the early schools of Buddhism. And so I wanted to be able to read them in the original. And so I learned Pali. And then in order to understand them, I felt that I had to write out the translations, to write out my mental translation as I was reading them. And then at a certain point, I showed them to some of my translations to an elder European monk in Sri Lanka, the German monk Venerable Nyanaponika. And he liked my translation, and then he could encourage me to continue doing translation.
And you must have spent years and years and years doing this now.
Well, I think I started doing translation in 1976. Yeah, in early 1976. Mm-hmm. And I'm still at it.
Well, the Buddha said a lot of things.
Yeah.
Sometimes he said the same thing more than once in more than one way.
Yeah, well, there's quite a lot of repetition in the early discourses.
Yes, sometimes translators resort to ellipses, I've noticed.
But now the computer programs with the word processing programs with the copy and paste makes it rather easy to translate.
Well, that explains it. You shouldn't have.
It's a bit. The volume of work is a bit deceptive,
yeah,
because a lot of it was created using the copy and paste function.
Now the truth comes out. It's commendable that you would be that honest. I guess it means you're a good Buddhist. I want to talk about a lot of things, but let's start out with an issue of translation. You commonly hear as a summary of one thing, a characterization of one thing the Buddha is said to have said, life is suffering. Now, first of all, I'm not sure he ever actually says it quite like that. You tell me if he ever says that, although it may, broadly speaking, capture his intent. But the other question, leaving aside whether he ever put it in the form of that kind of sentence, is the word suffering, which is a translation of the term dukkha.
Right.
And tell us whether suffering is really an adequate translation.
I don't think that the rendering of dukkha as suffering is adequate, even though I use it. But when I use it as a translation, it has to be accompanied by some explanation of what is meant by dukkha. Now, the word dukkha originally in the early Indian languages would have meant pain and suffering, and it's contrasted with sukha. So sukha is pleasure or happiness, and dukkha is pain or suffering. But the Buddha took this word from ordinary discourse, and then he gave it a wider, more extended meaning, so that the word dukkha comes to mean something like, I would say, deficient, inadequate, unsatisfactory. And then the Buddha doesn't explicitly say, not to my recollection, that life is suffering. But what he says, for example, in the First Noble Truth is that this is the noble truth of dukkha. And then he elaborates upon the different forms of dukkha. And now, when he explains what he means by dukkha in greater detail, he sometimes explains that there are three aspects to dukkha. And I think this makes the meaning more clearer. Okay, so one aspect of dukkha is what is called dukkha dukkhata, which means the unsatisfactoriness because of suffering. It's actually like a repetition. And so this is that there's unsatisfactoriness or deficiency in life because there is experience of pain, dejection, misery, disappointment, and various other experiences that we would group under the general label of maybe suffering is rather strong, but of pain and causes for dissatisfaction. Okay, but in the second aspect of dukkha is what is called the unsatisfactoriness due to change. And this is applied specifically to our pleasant experiences that are held to, that are grasped with an attitude of clinging to the pleasant experiences as a basis for satisfaction, clinging to them in the expectation that they'll be permanent and stable. And so when we cling to these pleasant experiences and then they change, then they eventuate in suffering. And so looking at them more deeply, we could see that even when we're experiencing the pleasant experiences, even when we've achieved what we take to be our satisfaction, then there's already a kind of subtle degree of deficiency or unsatisfactoriness underlying that pleasure, that happiness, because it's vulnerable to change and will produce suffering.
So the future suffering is implicit in the current pleasure.
Right. When that pleasure is held to with an attitude of clinging and grasping.
So if I eat a candy bar with the wrong attitude, so to speak, an attitude of grasping or thirst or craving, which, by the way, is the way I always eat a candy bar, it's inevitable that the moment will come when it's over and I want more, or I'm, the sugar rush subsides or whatever, and so there's something ultimately unsatisfying about it.
And of course, clinging to the enjoyable taste of a candy bar is a little bit innocent. But when people are, grasping after accumulations of wealth, position, power, then sort of the underlying uncertainty of their position and the sort of ambience of anxiety surrounding it then becomes much more prominent and much more cutting.
Now, the prescription, as you kind of suggested, the Buddha isolates the cause of the suffering or unsatisfactoriness as thirsting, craving, trying to cling to pleasures.
Yeah.
And the prescription is to not do that, to not desire things in that sense.
Yeah. Somebody has just come to the door to bring me, it's my evening drink, I think.
Oh, you deserve that, so go ahead.
Okay, please come. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, we could continue.
All right. The prescription sounds pretty severe. He's asking us to rid ourselves of thirst, of desire, almost of attraction to things.
Okay, let me just come to the third, because I was going through the three aspects of dukkha. Okay, then the third aspect of dukkha is what is called sankhara dukkhata, which means it's a rather difficult expression to translate, but the way I would render it is the unsatisfactoriness which is inherent in all conditioned phenomena. Okay, and this is a certain degree of unsatisfactoriness or inadequacy which is intrinsic to all conditioned phenomena simply by the fact that they are conditioned, that they're subject to constant arising and passing away. that they are empty of any kind of substantial core.
And does conditioned mean caused or?
Yeah, brought about by causes and conditions.
And the unconditioned
Yeah.
is equated with nirvana, right?
Yeah, that is correct.
So to reach nirvana is to escape the world of the merely conditioned and the world of the caused.
Right, yeah.
But to reach, sorry.
Yeah, if one were to use the kind of language that comes out of the Christian tradition, one might say sankhara dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness of the conditioned, might be equated with the sense of the unsatisfactoriness of contingency, that all things that are contingent are not really able to fully satisfy maybe the human spirit.
But to get to that state of nirvana or liberation, complete liberation from dukkha,
yeah.
Is it fair to say that it's necessary to, well, certainly you have to let go of desire, of lust, of thirst, and so on, but is it fair to say almost that you have to transcend attraction itself and aversion itself, attraction to things that are likable and aversion to things that people generally don't like?
I would say that one has to transcend attraction or attachment to things which are provocative of craving. But I would say that there are, I would call them innocent pleasures, which can be enjoyed without necessarily provoking craving and attachment. For example, I would say that enjoyment of the beauties of nature, that the beauties of nature are not necessarily objects of attachment and attraction, in the sense that there's a craving underlying that.
And is there a way to even savor food, enjoy food without attachment?
Actually, what I find is that when one practices eating with mindfulness, one can enjoy the taste of the food without a craving arising and underlying that experience of enjoyment.
So
I want to come back to, there was a question that you started to ask just when the knocking came on the door, and that is, you were asking whether it's necessary for a Buddhist to give up his attraction to every kind of enjoyment in the world. And this is a point which often, in my view, leads to misunderstanding of Buddhism, because one picks up reading about Buddhism and studying Buddhism using texts that were originally given by the Buddha to the monastics, to those who had renounced, the household life in order to strive single-mindedly for nirvana. But now the Buddha taught many different people, teaching them in ways that are appropriate for their lifestyle, for their particular circumstances. And so the Buddha doesn't lay down injunctions for all of his followers to immediately give up, their wives, husbands, children, house occupations, homes, and go forth into homelessness to enter the forest to lead a life of full-time meditation. But for those who are living the household life, he teaches them the kinds of wholesome enjoyment that are appropriate to the household life. He teaches husbands how to take care of their wives, wives how to take care of their husbands, parents how to take care of their children, children how to look after their parents, how lay people can work at forms of right livelihood, and so on. And so I think it's wrong when reading Buddhism, or incorrect to try to impose, the model of monastic life on all Buddha's followers and think that they're all expected to live up to the level of, renunciation and austerity that's expected of somebody who's made that full commitment